Well, good evening or good morning or good afternoon to all the Cockpits and Cocktails listeners. I am Natalie Fly Girl Kelly. It's just me tonight. My friend Fly Alyssa couldn't make it tonight. That's okay. We're going to have a good time anyway, and we have such a great guest. I am excited to have Shannon Huffman Polson on, and she is just so cool, badass woman. She is an author, and she's written 2 books, The Grit Factor and North of Hope. I take my glasses off. It's harder for me to see. And she's CEO of the Grit Institute or Grit Institute.
The Grit Institute. That's right. At thegritinstitute.com.
Which is just makes me just want to get down and nitty gritty and all that good stuff with that name. But I kind of happened upon your name. Well, there's been some military people that we've had on this show, Cockpits and Cocktails, and so it's funny how there are the military pilots, females it's kind of a small world, so one kind of knows the other, and it's just like all these names come together. And Shannon was one of these people that I heard this name and did a little research and invited her on. And I am excited that you joined us. Welcome, Shannon.
Thanks so much. It's great to be with you, Natalie.
It is fun. We are both kind of not in our element, not in our home. We're kind of on vacations in different spots, which makes it all the more fun, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. It's great to call in from Alaska. I'm up in a little log cabin up in Denali Park.
Now you're from Alaska, correct?
I'm from Alaska. I grew up in Anchorage, actually, but we spend every August for the most part in Denali.
Okay. I bet it's gorgeous.
It is beautiful. It's rainy and cool, which compared to where I normally live in north central Washington, which is smoky and hot and has just had wildfires going through, I'm grateful for the cool air and for the overcast. So
yeah, it's been kind of a crazy summer. It's been so hot and dry in Ohio as well, but and I've heard about all these wildfires, which is just so concerning, and I hate that we're going through that right now.
It's tough. It's tough a lot of places for sure.
Yeah. So tell me, we're going to talk about several different things. I want to start with your aviation story, your aviation background, because it's pretty cool what you've done. And thank you for your service, by the way. That's awesome. I appreciate you and all that you sacrificed.
Well, it's an honor, as I'm sure all of your guests have said, to have had the opportunity to serve. But I started out as one of the first women to fly the Apache helicopter in the U.S. Army a number of years ago now, after doing ROTC at Duke University and then spending 2 years in the National Guard and then 8 years on active duty. And I like to say my time was between the deserts. So I served in both Bosnia and in Korea, but only a practice exercise in Kuwait. So those who are there and right now in the wake of the challenge in Afghanistan, it's a whole different deal. So I have enormous respect for that. But I'm incredibly grateful for the experience and many of the people that I had the opportunity to serve with, and of course flying the Apache, which was fantastic.
Yeah. So how did you get into flying the Apache? Did you always know you wanted to fly helicopters, or how did that all come to be?
Well, I grew up in Alaska, as you figured out, and so aviation is a huge part of Alaska, as you know, and I have been exposed to it since I was very, very young. Had the opportunity to fly a little bit on some small planes and part of a climbing trip up to Denali actually as well. But then went to college and was trying to figure out a way to pay for college, and ROTC seemed to be the way that would make the most sense. And I totally connected to the sense of purpose, the sense of service, the sense of something bigger than myself. And at the same time, I realized, hey, if I have this obligation to pay back, and I do, what is the most challenging and the coolest thing I can do? And that definitely was aviation. But, in 1993, when I was getting ready to graduate, the Apaches weren't open to women to fly. So that was an entirely different story. And I knew that flying was something I'd always wanted to do, but Apaches were something that developed in the course of the journey for sure.
So you mentioned Denali, and just a little side note, Didn't you, wasn't there like this kind of milestone, kind of cool like achievement that you reached? Tell me about that real quick.
And this was in 1991, so I'm sure that this has been far surpassed. But when I had the opportunity to climb Denali, I was home from college my sophomore year, and I had been training for an Army school, actually air assault school. So I'd been running lots and lots of miles with a big backpack on my back. So I'd basically been training for a climb. But I went to a Rotary meeting with my mother, and they were getting ready in Anchorage, Alaska, to do a 60th anniversary climb of Denali. And so it was a month away, and I'd been training for something that could be considered to be somewhat similar. And I signed up, and it was completely crazy. I mean, it's the kind of thing you do when you're 19 years old and you know nothing different. But it
Yeah,
was a really amazing opportunity, and super tough. I mean, still the most physically difficult thing that I've ever done by
really.
orders of magnitude, but a really incredible opportunity at the same time.
That is awesome. I mean, you've been through all this training, you really didn't know that it was gonna lead up to that. It just all the time
Right.
just kind of worked out perfectly.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Back to the Apache. So you're in the military. You're at this point, I guess, when you go through your training where, I mean, based on kind of what I know, which you can correct me if I'm wrong, you start to
Yeah.
choose kind of which paths you want to take. So how did that
Right.
happen?
Yeah, well, maybe I'll back up a little bit because as I was at ROTC, I was part of the ROTC detachment at Duke, which was also North Carolina State and UNC Chapel Hill, and I was also drilling with the National Guard because my scholarship was what they called simultaneous membership program. So you're required to be a member of the National Guard while you're going to college. And I was part of an aviation unit at that point. They were not the pure aviation units that they became later, but they had Blackhawks and Apaches and 58s, and so I was assigned to a Black Hawk company because, of course, that was the only kind of helicopter that women were allowed to fly at the time. And I remember towards the end of my senior year, I went out to the state aviation office to receive my assignment for the years ahead. And I'm just a cadet. I'm just a student. I'm not yet graduated, not yet commissioned. And I report to this colonel, and he sits behind a desk that seems as wide as the room, right? Shiny plate glass windows going up behind him. And I'm trying not to shake as I stand at attention. I've just turned 21 years old. And I remember he asked me to sit down, and we exchanged a couple of pleasantries back and forth. This was supposed to be about my assignment for the years that would follow in the Guard. And I remember him looking at me in the middle of a sentence. He stops and he sort of leans back in his chair and he looks down his nose and he says, "You realize, cadet, that you will never fly an attack aircraft."
Mm.
And I looked back at him and I recognized his comment for what it was meant to be, which was this small and mean and cutting comment, because at the time attack aircraft weren't even open to women to fly. But I also had learned at that point in the military that there's sometimes that you say yes sir, and so I said yes sir. And I went back to the ROTC detachment on the campus of Duke University and requested a transfer out of the National Guard and onto active duty. And then later that spring, Congress changed the game on that colonel and on everybody else, lifted the combat exclusion clause in 1993, right, in the spring. And suddenly everything in the inventory was open for women and men to fly. So I report to Fort Rucker, Alabama later that year. I began the aviation officer basic course and the initial entry rotary wing course. We all start out in Hueys at the time, if you can imagine. And then at some point we have the opportunity to make the request and also assess into our different airframes. That's based on class rank and how you do on these assessments, and probably a lot of things we didn't know at the time. And I had started out in Hueys, and I requested a transfer into the scout and attack track. So then trained on OH-58s for nights and for tactics, and then was earned and was given a transfer into the AH-64A Apache attack helicopter.
Wow. So did you want to go back to the sky and tell him, ha ha?
I get that question a lot. I have the opportunity to speak to companies and organizations around the world now because after the military, of course, I went through business school and then spent some time in the corporate world as well. And so I now speak to large organizations and companies on leadership and grit and on the lessons that are in The Grit Factor, which is the book that I know we'll get around to talking about in a moment. And people ask quite often, did you ever have a chance to talk to that colonel again? And I keep thinking he might be in an audience someday, but he's never come up to talk to me if he was.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think based on some of the conversations I've had with some other female military pilots of various nature, the there was no really disrespect towards him. That was just how it was, So
Right.
it's like even if he wanted it to be different, it wasn't going to be different. That was just how it was. So he was maybe trying to squelch any dreams maybe you had because it just wasn't going to happen. I don't know. Maybe he thought it was for
Yeah.
your benefit. I'm not sure.
You never know, right? You never know. I mean, I have the chance to work with some of the best people that I'll ever know in my life while I was in uniform, and some of the worst as well. And
Yeah.
I didn't know him enough to make an
Yeah.
assessment for sure. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you started your training as a female, what was the environment like for you? How was the training? I'm sure it's hard for anybody. Was it, and you had no aviation background really from your family or anything, right? Prior to. So this is
That's
all
right.
new to you. What was it
Yep.
like? What's it like learning how to fly a military helicopter like that? That's such a cool helicopter.
I mean, it's pretty amazing, right, to have these opportunities. I have a young son right now who's 8 who wants to be a fighter pilot, and he says, "Well, I want to save up money for flight school." I'm like, "Well, if you want to fly, if you fly in the military, like they're going to train you better than
Yeah.
anybody else is going to." And so yeah, it's initially it's tough. I thought I was never going to learn how to hover. There's like this 10 hours where you're trying to practice hovering, and you think you're never ever going to make it, and you're swinging this Huey all over this football field size patch of
Oh
land,
gosh,
and then
yeah.
10 hours in, somehow you just do it, and they call it a hover button, right? And it's been a while now, but I remember like there's some point when suddenly you're hovering, and you've just been killing it for like 10 days of an hour a day, and your stick buddy's been flying an hour a day as well, and everybody's all over the place, and then suddenly it just comes, and you think all along the way, I'm just going to be that one person who cannot get up. I'm going to be the one,
Yeah.
right, that can't do it. And it comes like everything else that you put your mind and your effort and your work into. So
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
that was a great metaphor. And the other part of that metaphor is, of course, and like with any flying, like you get into the helicopter those first few hours and you think it's about controlling it, and it's really kind of about just sort of letting it be, right,
Mm.
and giving it a nudge here and there. And so it's the over control that causes more of the problems in the end of the
Yeah.
wheel. So
So true. That's how it is too in a fixed wing aircraft, especially with the landings. You overcorrect and you're trying to line it up and they're just like, just kind of let it, just minor adjustments. And
right.
that's a really hard thing when you're first starting out to do. But I love how you said you feel like it's just you that's having a hard time with this one thing. Because so many times I have felt that way. It was just like, okay, they don't really understand that, everybody else says it's hard, but I really think it's harder for me, or I'm just not going to get it. I'm just not, good enough at this. And we beat ourselves up. And I remember
Right.
instructors telling me everybody feels like that. You have to
That's right.
just keep at it and stick to it, and you'll come out on the other side.
Exactly. I mean, it's, the metaphor that I love, and I just love this metaphor so much, and you'll appreciate it no matter whether you are listening as a rotary wing pilot or as a fixed wing pilot. But I always talk to organizations again with these keynotes, and if you're ever in one of these, I will be using this because it's just really resonates. That when you take off, right, you get ready for takeoff, you start this run-up procedure that you know so well that you know it by heart, but you always use the checklist, and you taxi out on the runway for takeoff, and I'll ask people to raise their hands and say, which way do you take off with an Apache helicopter? And people say up, and of course up is correct, right? We all want to be in the sky ultimately, but you turn the nose to face the wind, right? And when you use it the right way, that resistance helps you to rise. And that's true no matter what kind of aircraft you're in, no matter what kind of challenge you're facing, you have to turn towards it, and you have to fly directly through it. And I think it's just a great metaphor for life,
Yes.
and all of the things that we're all facing right now.
Yes, so true. I love that. I love that. So your career flying with the Apache, so how long did it last, and what were some of your hardest parts about being a helicopter pilot, and what were some of the most fun things that you
Oh,
remember?
yeah. Well, I mean, I'm probably a short timer compared to lots of your listeners because I served active duty for 8 years, and 7 of those were in aviation positions of some form or fashion. And my service was primarily at Fort Bragg. That was my first duty station. I worked in operations and then led my first flight platoon, then took another flight platoon in another battalion that was deploying to Bosnia. So we deployed to Bosnia, came back to Fort Bragg, and I did the military intelligence officer advanced course, which of course was non-flying in Huachuca, Arizona, and then went to Korea, and then flew in Korea for about 15 months, and then came back to the States to Fort Bliss, Texas. So that was the 8 years as a quick overview. I think some of the most fun flying was always a mission profile, right? And Korea probably had the fewest restrictions on flying, so it was a ton of fun to be able to just kill it. We're flying mostly, of course, in Korea in support of the 2nd Infantry Division, the 2nd Brigade Combat Team. We were supporting infantry, so that's kind of the close combat attack tactics that were used, for example, in Vietnam. So it's very different than Fort Bragg, where the mission was this deep attack. So you realize these airframes can do a pretty wide variety of missions, right? Depending on what the requirements are. And I would just say anytime we were in mission profile was absolutely the most exciting, the most interesting, the most focused that we could be, as opposed to being back on base where you've got, all the demands of daily life as well as you're flying. But I remember Korea specifically, there was no hard deck, there was no, and we flew the border between North and South Korea in large part, and actually the no-fly line, which is 2 kilometers south of that. And so there was this sense of danger, like if you violate that no-fly line, it's an act of war, right? It's an act of war, you get shot down. And so even though there's no sense of that tension in the States, while you're deployed there, while you're flying there, there's this very real sense of doing something that was important, and the flying was amazing. It was amazing. It was tough, mountain flying. It's mountain flying, and it's mountain flying on a border that's hostile. So I think that was a double dose of adrenaline.
Definitely. So when you fly the Apache, what's the crew like? How many people are?
Yeah, we're two pilots in the aircraft, and there's no room for anything else because the Apache is essentially a flying weapons platform, right? So it's 58 feet long, it's 18 feet wide, it's 12 feet high, it's powered by two 1,850 horsepower jet engines. Now this is the AH-64A, they're now into the Echo model, I believe. But on the nose, there's 3 different sight systems. It can see in day and night in adverse conditions. That's the TADS and the FLIR, the forward-looking infrared system, of course, that we look at through a monocle over our right eye. On the wings, there was any combination of the 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rocket and the anti-tank Hellfire missile. And then under the belly is the 30-millimeter high explosive cannon. So the landing gear is fixed, as with most helicopters. And we flew primarily, tactical missions, low to the ground, and two rated pilots. The backseater in the Apache is the pilot in command. The front seater, who was my position, is in charge of navigation and communications, and then weapons deployment. So it really becomes more so maybe than some other aircraft, a systems management sort of a thing. And that's true for any kind of aviation for sure. But suddenly you've got not just communications and navigation, but you're communicating with, in Bosnia, we're talking to any number of the NATO forces, as well as managing all the weapons platforms as well. So pretty
stepping up the comms quite a bit.
Yeah. No, it was there was a lot to keep track of for sure. And back then we're still on Australian fold maps. So navigation is so different now than it was then. It's just sort of crazy to think about all the things that you have in the cockpit now that we didn't have back then.
Yeah, I don't know how I could have done it without my iPad.
Can't imagine flying with an iPad, but I bet you get to the place where you can't do it without it, right? So
right. Totally. My uncle, I flew a lot with him, and even when the iPad was an option, he still just continued to use the paper charts, and that was his comfort. That's where he was comfortable, and he knew what he was doing, so it worked for him. And it's the same thing, so it's just in a different format, I guess.
Different format, that's right. And all of our, all of my 2 kids will, I'm sure, not even be able to imagine what paper was used for as reference.
I know. I love the paper charts, though. I think they're cool, and I like to spread them out and look at them, and it's just neat how detailed they are. They're just neat,
Yeah, no, I think there's nothing like paper as both a writer and a flyer. I love the paper. So.
Right. Well, that was a great little lead in to your chat about. So you decided, tell me, kind of wrap up your transition from your military into how did your writing career start from that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I get a lot of people that ask like, well, how did you start this? Like you published your first book in your 30s and like how did you just start doing that? I was like, well, I didn't just start doing it then. I've been writing my entire life. Like when I was 12 years old and did that little junior high book that says, what are you going to be when you grow up, right? Mine was a writer and an artist. So that's where I'm coming back to now. And I had been writing, I was an English major in college and I had been writing the newsletters or articles all through my Army career as well. So this is not a new venture, but it was a new focus area, I think, as a complete focus. Um, I left the military after my 8 years was up and went back to the business school, actually, at the Tuck School at Dartmouth. And that was a big transition for sure to leave. And right as I left, actually, it's so interesting with all that's happening right now because I left in August 2001. And then I got to business school and then September 11th, right?
Yeah.
And suddenly I feel like I am in the wrong place. Like I should never have left. I should have been back there. I should have been doing all of this that everybody else is doing that I know and in a way that I know. And I'm, doing spreadsheets in in the Ivory Tower in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
And it was a really tough 2 years.
I bet that was, yeah.
Yeah. So difficult to get there. And that doesn't even answer the writing piece yet, but I was trying to find a way to take those skills from the military that are so operational, logistics and personnel and making stuff happen. I was like, well, business school is going to be the natural transition for that. It's making stuff happen. I like to make stuff happen. I do that pretty well. And so went through business school, spent some time in the corporate world at both a medical device company called Guidant Corporation, later Boston Scientific, and then at Microsoft. And, we had a family tragedy in 2005. My father and my stepmother were killed by a grizzly bear while they were camping in the Arctic. And
my goodness.
Not the kind of thing that most people are expecting or have happen. And I realized at that point, and I didn't leave for 3 more years from Microsoft, but I knew I wasn't doing the thing that I was meant to do. I needed to be doing what I was meant to do, and that was writing. And so my first book, North of Hope, is about taking a trip back up the year after they died to follow their footsteps, to take that same trip, to be able to.
Oh my gosh, I have like goosebumps right now. I have to.
Well, you can order it. You can order North of Hope, and there's good aviation in that too, right? Like getting out to the Arctic and Alaska, it takes 2 flights into the remote, the remote backcountry, and it's about as remote as it gets in the world. And so that was the first piece. And I realized I was at Microsoft. I went back, took this trip that followed their footsteps, worked there for 3 more years, have amazing friends still from Microsoft, just an incredible group of people. And I was like, I need to write this book. I need to leave. I need to do the thing that I know that I've always been meant to do. And I left to write North of Hope, finished my MFA as well, and then published North of Hope, and then was on this journey and thought, hey, I love business. I love operations. How can I combine this creative aspect with this business and operational piece that I really, really love? And that has become my career over the last 10 years, which is, speaking about leadership, about grit and resilience, about optimism, about storytelling, about purpose, and then developing courses at the Grit Institute that I act as a leadership facilitator for in, again, these same companies and organizations. So keynotes, and then leadership facilitation, and then of course the book, which is the Grit Factor. And the Grit Factor, it's been such an honor to have the Grit Factor out in the world, which is the second book. So North of Hope first, and then the Grit Factor.
Wow, that is just so amazing. That I love to hear it when things kind of come full circle. I don't know if that's the word, but you have all these interests and these talents, and you don't really know, when you're younger, how this is all gonna work out. How these things I love gonna come together, and the experiences that I've had, and use them in a way that is fulfilling to you, but also can be helpful to others.
Exactly. And that was the genesis, to be honest, of the Grit Factor, the book. I was already speaking to organizations, speaking to companies about leadership and helping them to work on that within their own cultures. But then I had this young lieutenant reach out, and she's getting ready to go to flight school back down to Fort Rucker, Alabama, begin this aviation career. And she reaches out through this online mentorship program and asks if I'll be her mentor. And I say, of course, I'd love to. I'd be honored. And then I started to doubt myself again, right? Like it had been a number of years since I'd served. I had transitioned into the corporate world. My experience as one of the first women to fly the Apache was surely somewhat unique. And so I wanted to know how I could scale what I offered to her as she started this career, or anybody that was either starting out or transitioning into something new. and then also scale the people to whom it was available once I'd done all this work. And that was the genesis of what became the Grit Factor. And I began this series of interviews over several years of leaders in the vanguards of their fields. They happen to be women, they happen to be military, they're heavily weighted towards aviators from World War II to the present. So, World War II WASPs all the way up to people who have been flying in recent engagements.
Yeah.
And all different ranks, general officers across the services, and a Navy submariner, and a Coast Guard combat rescue swimmer, and one of the first women Army Rangers who also flew Apaches. So this incredible cohort of leaders, and hearing like, what are your stories? What are your lessons learned? And then synthesizing those stories and lessons learned with the latest in management and leadership research, and then bringing that down to a tactical takeaway. So we start with story, we get into the research, and then we say, here's the tactical takeaway. Here's how to apply that in your own life. And that is why it's such an honor to have the Grit Factor, courage, resilience, and leadership in the most male-dominated organization in the world, out in the world, because it really, truly is making a difference in so many people's lives. And it's such an honor to help bring it to all of us.
Yeah, that is cool. So you mostly offer this program to business organizations, leaders in business, or explain?
Yeah, so I do keynotes, so like big presentations to really big conferences, right? Like sales conferences or kickoff conferences or that sort of a thing. And that's just typically to businesses and large organizations. But then the training itself is available to anybody. So I can either facilitate it for an organization and I can tweak it to make it very specific to the needs of that organization.
Yeah.
Or it can be accessed just by you or by your friends at thegritinstitute.com. And we're just re-releasing Going for Grit, which is kind of the signature keynote course. It's awesome. Honestly, it's like the best of the Grit Factor. And it goes a little deeper into a couple of areas as well. Paths to Purpose will be coming out just a little bit later this fall. I developed that for Intuit and for Verizon, actually, specifically, and then have taught this as well at Microsoft. So some pretty big companies have been part of this, and it really has been, again, like this incredible honor to bring this into the world when we really need that reconnection to purpose. We need that reconnection to resilience and grit in a time when none of us could ever have expected the challenges that we're facing.
Totally. That is so true. So overall, this program, is it geared towards women? Is it geared towards overcoming certain things? What is it all about?
Yeah, I like to say that really the focus, I certainly use examples of women leaders. And I like to think that if I used all male leaders, nobody would even blink. So it shouldn't even be a thing, right? Like it's just, they happen to be leaders and they happen to be women. And what that means is, as you know, they have overcome a double crucible, which means that they've had the challenges of the job that anyone would have, as well as, in many cases, the challenges of an environment that didn't always accept them being there and sometimes was openly hostile. So we think of that as a double crucible, and that's a term that was coined by a Stanford law professor. But the program is available and applicable to absolutely anybody. And honestly, like high school on up to somebody who is seasoned and maybe facing a challenge or a change. It's really, I think, especially relevant for those facing change and facing challenge. And that's exactly where all of us are finding ourselves right now. So leadership, grit, resilience, storytelling, and this connection to core purpose, that is exactly the sweet spot for every single one of us as we try to navigate this pretty uncertain reality. And I like to say it's this horizon that's unclear, right? You're flying VFR, but you can't see the horizon. And that's really disorienting.
Yes. That's so true. I love that. Especially because we all want purpose. We all want to matter, make a difference. We all want to fulfill our own, like, I don't know if destiny is the word, but our own, path and reach those things that we're destined to do and we're good at, we're talented at, and share those kind of gifts and things to others. So to find that, it's not always easy. It's kind of like when we're talking about, you always doubt yourself and you're like, well, yeah, but they passed it, but I don't know if I can pass, I feel like I'm different and I don't have what it takes. And to overcome, yes, you do have what it takes. And so do you have exercises? Is that how people work on these, because a lot of it's like self-esteem and stuff like that, or learning how to speak up and say what you want and go after those things that you dream of. It doesn't have to be a dream. You can actually make it happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's part of the power of both the Grit Factor, the book, which is available anywhere books are sold, as well as the Grit Institute and the courses at the Grit Institute, because it starts again with the stories. And I enter into everything both in the course and in the book with stories. So there's a reading and a reading reflection. You'll also have an action plan. You'll kind of have this a journal that you can download and continue to take notes in as you go along. But then there's these tactical exercises to say, here's the story, here's the research, reflect on this a little bit. How does this apply to you? And now here's the exercise to take it deeper into your own life, because that's what we really need to do, right? And coming back to the purpose concept, Natalie, you're so right. Like, purpose has always been important, and it's one of my favorite parts of the entire Grit Factor. And the lessons that come out of the Grit Factor come out into 3 sections. They're commit, learn, and launch. That's connection to your past. That's a deep engagement in the present, and then that's looking towards the future with both authenticity as well as audacity and adaptability. And then to take those from these kind of more amorphous concepts down into what it really means to connect to them ourselves, then each chapter will go into tactical exercises and say, okay, let's talk about what it means to commit. What does it mean to own your own story? What does it mean to drill down to core purpose? And all of the research that's coming out of the pandemic, especially, is that purpose is the most critical thing for us to spend time reconnecting to. And it's not easy, to your point, right? It's not
Right.
easy work. It's like deep internal reflective work. And we've got to give ourselves the time and the space to do that work.
Yeah, yeah. And sometimes we feel like if it's really hard, maybe it's not supposed to be my purpose. Maybe that's, maybe it's not the right fit, when really if you stick through the lessons you learn by sticking through something, and maybe I'm not going to come out being an airline pilot or whatever, but
Right.
maybe this is leading me to something else, what I'm supposed to be doing,
Exactly.
and somehow aviation plays a role in that. You just don't know.
Well, aviation, I mean, I feel like the metaphors are just replete in aviation, right? Like every single one of your listeners knows what it means to like work hard towards your check ride, right? Or towards your new certification. And then you're up in the air and everything falls apart, right? Like you've studied, you've learned, you've got your flight plan. And then suddenly the wind picks up, or suddenly there's something else, that a different weather system kicks in, and you're like, wow, now you've got to respond. And that really ends up where the Grit Factor ends with adaptability, right? Commit, learn, and launch. Launch is this looking towards the future. Adaptability is kind of the keystone, and that is the absolute number one thing that we need to be able to have to negotiate uncertain horizons, right? This flying VFR when you can't see where you're going, that's pretty disorienting. And adaptability is key. And aviators have to have that. They have to have that grounding in the present, knowing where they've come from, knowing their stuff, but then be able to adapt as things continue to change.
Yeah.
So I think I just love the metaphors in aviation.
That's true.
Right.
There's a ton of them, aren't there?
There are. Turn the nose to face the wind. And yeah, that's right.
Right. Right. I know. I love when I'm feeling like I need a little pick me up, or I love to go look up aviation quotes, and some of the things that come up, they're like, yeah, that's right. And one of the things I tell people too, when they do a check ride or they're getting prepared, I remember one of my instructors telling me, and I don't know if it was good or bad, but it prepared me in a way that, not everybody passes a check ride the first time.
That's right.
That doesn't mean this isn't meant for you. You can't let that defeat you. Maybe that's what your journey needs to be. Maybe there's something you needed to learn from that you wouldn't have learned if you had passed it. There's a certain area where you're weak, and you really need to hone in on that and figure, and that will help build you in some way. That it sucks and it's embarrassing, and you don't want it to happen to you, but it does happen. But it doesn't mean, oh, I can't be a pilot because I messed up.
That's exactly right. And I'm writing a book review right now for the Navy magazine Proceedings. And it's about Amy McGrath's new book that's coming out, Honor Bound. Actually, I think it just was released. And, she's one of the first FA-18 combat pilots in the Marines. And one of the things that she says, and actually I interviewed her for the Grit Factor, so she's in there as well. And I love one of her quotes is like, I don't trust someone who hasn't failed, right? Like if you haven't failed and you haven't learned how to come out of failure, then that's a little dangerous almost, right? Like you want to work with people who know what it means to fail, and you know what it means to overcome that failure. And that's an important part of the whole process, the whole experience.
So true. Yeah, I love that. I love that. So once you like, do you fly anymore? I mean, once you stop with the Apache, have you ever been, flying anymore? Like, tell me what's happened after that in aviation for you.
Not too much, for better or worse. I have had a chance to fly a little bit with some friends, civilians with small airplanes. But at the end of the day, and again, growing up in Alaska, most of the accidents, of course, they say it's weather, weather, and weather, right? But it's
Yeah,
also like the people who just fly once in a while. And I kind
yeah,
of feel like you should fly all the time or not at all.
right.
And that is just based on, again, my time in the military, where when we were good, we were really good. And when you didn't get to fly, you were you were not so much. And
Yeah.
I have two little boys right now that are 8 and 11. I work, my husband works. We like to backpack and ski. And so I
Mhm.
do miss it quite a bit, but I also think that it's important to either have that be your thing, or just recognize that you'll go off
But
with
it's
friends.
not.
And
Yeah, you can't
yeah,
dedicate the time to it to make sure you're safe. And
exactly.
yes, that's so true. Well, I don't want to say that you need to get up and fly anymore,
Well,
but
anyone who wants to fly out to the Methow Valley, I'll go out with you. But I have actually thought, as the boys are getting older, I'm like, when they start to get busy with their own stuff, maybe it's something I
you
can
never
do
know.
again. Have
That's
the
right.
time to
You
do.
never know
That's right.
what's going to happen. And even if it doesn't, it did lead to you to where you are right now. So, you know,
Exactly.
that's
Exactly. That's right.
were you involved in the military, like I know there's like some helicopter aviation history type organizations. Are you involved in those?
I've done a little bit to support some of the work on bringing the WASPs back into the forefront, right? The Women
Okay.
Aviation Service
Yes.
Pilots. And actually, a fun story. We're out at Denali right now, and we were out at Camp Denali. Actually, just some friends run this place in the west end of the park, which is this absolutely stunning lodge area. And we didn't stay there because that's a little bit outside of our budget, but it's highly recommended for anybody who can manage it. But they do have a small cabin that used to be owned by Ginny Woods, and Ginny Woods and Celia started Camp Denali, and they were both WASPs. And so I'm reading about them to my sons, and I'm like, yeah, they were women Air Force service pilots. They flew, they did transport, they did all, but basically the WASP flew everything in the
Yeah.
inventory, right?
Hmm.
And then they ended up adventuring all over Europe, and then coming back to Alaska from Washington State, where they were both from. So there's some kind of fun connection between Denali and the WASPs. But I've done a
Yeah.
little bit of work with the effort to bring the WASPs back to the forefront. And to
Yeah.
be honest, when I had originally conceived of the grit factor, I was going to look at those Russian fighter regiments in World War II. There's three
The
of them
night
that are just
witches.
the Night Witches, and then
Yeah.
there's two more, right? There's three of
Yeah.
them, and they flew everything in the Russian inventory, and they were unbelievable
Yes.
pilots. Like, they were just phenomenal. And it didn't end up being something that worked. As you start to put the book together and you start to find the
Yeah.
publisher, it ends up falling out a slightly different way. But I do look forward to being able to include that in some
Yeah.
form or fashion as I go forward. So,
Yeah.
so
Well, it's
yeah.
good. I mean, you know of it, so I'm sure you talk about it. And, it's funny because I never heard a thing about the WASP until probably 5 years ago. And it was like
Exactly.
nobody talked about it. And
Well, nobody
and the
talked
night
about it.
witches.
That's
I
it.
mean, well, I've definitely never heard of the night witches, and someone happened to recommend it as I was sort of researching the WASP, and I was like, oh my gosh, these airplanes these women were flying and the conditions they were in. It was just, and nobody really talks about it at all.
Nobody talk. I mean, it's just phenomenal. Honestly, the
Yeah,
stories are incredible, and they still don't get the credit or the
yeah,
coverage that they really ought to, given the exploits that they
yeah.
they were able to pull off.
Yeah, I hope that
Yeah.
changes and that we'll hear more and more stories about them and come to realize. I mean, we think we have it hard sometimes.
Oh my gosh. I mean, it's funny. I remember actually when I was first at Fort Bragg, and the newspaper just had covered my arrival at Fort Bragg, and they're like, "This is the first woman Apache pilot at Fort Bragg." And somebody interviewed a WASP in North Carolina, and again, I'd never heard of the WASPs at
Yeah,
that point. So it's the 90s, right? With the internet's not even a thing. So
yeah, right.
unless that's out in the common domain, we just don't know about it. And somebody asks this old lady who lives somewhere in some little town in North Carolina, what do you think about this? And she said, well, that's no big deal. We did that 50 years ago. And I was like, oh my gosh, isn't that amazing? And
Yeah,
nobody even knew. And they really are so humble. And many of them have passed now. There's only a few left. And they're so humble about their experiences and what they did. I think it was just a whole nother generation, right?
Yes.
And they just went into being school teachers or wives or whatever it was. And just
they're not on Instagram with their selfies.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. That's right.
No, I'm always amazed, because even the men pilots that would take some of these airplanes, like their first solo was actually the first time in particular airplanes, like that didn't only had one seat, and they're in these crazy big powerful machines, and for the first time, and that happens to be their first solo. It's crazy.
Jeez. I know. It's amazing to consider it. And I actually sort of envied it. I was reading Celia Engini's stories. I was like, oh, I mean, they're just doing this amazing work in aviation, right? And again, typically when women weren't even allowed, the Air Force wouldn't even let them fly to Alaska, right? And that's how they ended up coming here eventually, is the Air Force said, oh, no, women can't go to Alaska. There's no facilities for them, which is such an absurd thing to say. Yeah. And they just sort of got annoyed. And so when they got out of the Air Force, they're like, okay, let's go fly to Alaska.
Yeah, so we're going to do this now.
I love it. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I do think that story is so good for whether you're in aviation or in something else, because you talk to women of the time who will say, gosh, it's so neat that you can do these things now. We didn't get to do that back then. I'm like, well, some people did. And like, what made them do that? I really don't know. It's an amazing thing. They were not wealthy necessarily. They were just, they were just girls who wanted to fly, and they found a way to do it. And that's a great lesson for all of us, no matter what the field is.
That's true. Yeah. You don't really know. Who knows what their background was? You just don't know why certain people do certain things, that they actually had the courage and the nerve to do it when most everyone else did not,
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Yep. Well, I thought this was great. I mean, I learned so much, and I have a lot of reading to do. I got to get some grit going.
That's right, the grit factor. No, I do think your listeners will really appreciate it. And then if you do, please leave a happy review on Amazon. That always helps all of us. And pass it on and tell all your friends. So. Yes. I'm again really just happy to have it in the world, and I'm happy to also pass on to you, if you like, a discount code for your listeners for Going for Grit. I'm really excited about the new release that's coming out September 9th.
That would be great. We would love that very much. So thank you so much for taking time out of your vacation to chat with me here on Cockpits and Cocktails. Tell everyone where they can find you on like social media, and if you have a website or anything like that, let us know what that is.
Yeah, great. I'm at shannonpolson.com, ShannonPolson.com, and also at thegritinstitute.com. I'm mostly active on LinkedIn and Twitter at A Border Life, LinkedIn at Shannon H Polson. And then I am on Instagram, and you'll get a smattering of all kinds of stuff, though. That's a little bit more personal as well as professional, but LinkedIn and Twitter for mostly professional engagement, and would love to see all of you there.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Shannon. I enjoyed it very much. Can't wait to read your books and follow you on LinkedIn and Instagram, Twitter, all that good stuff, and see what you're up to next.
Likewise, Natalie. I loved our conversation. Thanks so much, and all the best getting back home for you.
Thank you very much. Have a good night.
You too. Take care.